Well, hello, it's Patricia Warby of Alchemy Therapies here, and I want to today talk about a very important paper that I started to talk about last week, and I want to conclude, which is a paper by Ronald R. Rudin. Now, every once in a while, you come across something that is so revolutionary, you're startled out of your regular view of the world. And I think this paper, put out there, hardly talked about anywhere. I haven't found any videos on this. I've found very, very many on anxiety and depression, and I've watched hundreds of them over the years, and none of them mention traumatic memory as a initiator of these complex and hard to treat conditions. I know so many people who are suffering from either anxiety or depression or both. Sometimes I myself have suffered from that in my mid-30s, and nobody told me that there was a reason for this. And it isn't just disordered brain chemistry, which is what the medical model currently looks at and prescribes antidepressant SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, if you want to know what that stands for, which is supposed to keep the happy chemical serotonin around a bit longer in your brain to alleviate the issue. But for me, they're only partially successful. I myself had to go through 3 or 4 different antidepressants before we found one that I could tolerate. And even then, the side effects were absolutely awful. So if you or someone you know is suffering from these conditions and wants to know if there's an alternative to antidepressant medications, well, this video and the information I'm about to give is for you, because this isn't widely known. Okay, now the first thing to understand is that there is a reason why you feel the way you do, and it isn't because you're missing certain chemicals naturally. It's because your brain is adapting to what it perceives in its environment. And so depression and anxiety are simply responses to internal meaning making in your brain. Now, how do we create meaning? Well, through learned experience, because when we're born, we have no understanding of the world. We're simply experiencing things without context. Our brains are very immature, so we don't have the ability to take in contextual information. All right, so the brain has to make sense of its environment by pattern matching. Now, this is really important. So pattern matching enables it to come to rapid, complex conclusions without having to evaluate each new novel experience. So it takes something from the past that it has made a conclusion of and associates it with that conclusion. Now, why is that important? Well, if you grew up with difficult events that overwhelmed you, what we call adverse childhood events, or simply you were a sensitive child, which 20% of children are, they grow up to be highly sensitive people. I'm also one of those. I didn't know that, but there's a 20% sort of specific range of people that have more highly attuned nervous systems. Now, that's good and bad. It's good when you're given support. It means you're very creative, very empathic, very in tune. But negatively, it can mean you overreact to stressors in your environment. Okay, so first thing to understand is it's not your fault if you're suffering from this at the moment. This is your brain doing what it's biologically wired to do, which is pattern match to previous experience. And sometimes it comes to the wrong conclusion. It may encode something as a traumatic experience when it was simply overwhelming. And you're not under life threat, but that's how it feels. That's what anxiety feels like. All of you who've experienced it may agree with me. If you're suffering anxiety, I can remember it felt like even going out the house was frightening. I did get quite agoraphobic at one point, and certainly interacting with people felt very, very uncertain, and I avoided it. We get to the point perhaps where we shake because we're so anxious all the time, and our threat response system is on high alert, and you've got very little resilience. In other words, very little space for everyday stressors to actually be tolerated. And so you're on high alert or hypervigilant for threat. And the parts of your brain that are doing this are in your limbic system, which is right in the middle, and in particular your amygdala, the hippocampus, which is really nearby, and a few other structures which help to modulate the inputs. But the amygdala is basically what fires and tells you danger, danger, danger. And unfortunately, it can get chronically activated. And even when you're experiencing symptoms of fear, that in turn can become traumatically encoded. And so you're in what we call the anxiety loop. You're afraid of your fear, or you're afraid of your symptoms, whatever they are. Now, what Ronald has contributed to this, which I think is absolutely fantastic, is how you may use what he calls electroceuticals, all right, which is an electrical rewiring, if you like, a new vibration, a new brainwave state to change this encoding in the brain. Now, we know that chemistry using pharmaceuticals, from which he's obviously borrowed the term, is at best, it's a hit and miss game. You know, you may have to go through 3 or 4 different antidepressants before you find one that works. And there is a small percentage of people, I think it's, well, not that small, I think it's about 30% of people who have what's called, quote unquote, treatment resistant depression, okay, which means basically the drugs don't work. Now, luckily, I wasn't one of those people. I did find something that did help me, but there are many, many people who go through trying one thing after another, and really and truly, it's not helping them. So there is a real need for something else that may work for people that doesn't require this being on antidepressants or multiple medications for the rest of your life just to manage it, because you're not actually treating the underlying problem. You're simply managing the symptom, which makes you feel horrible and stops you from enjoying life. So Ronald has, I talked about his background, I talked a little bit about what he does last week, and I'll include last week's video in the show notes below. But he was looking at a new model and a psychosensory treatment, which he calls Havening. Now, Havening, I came across his book, by the way. He has a book which is probably, if you're interested in this, is well worth exploring. I'll include the link in the show notes below. But the paper I'm quoting from here is something called Harnessing Electroceuticals to Treat Disorders Arising from Traumatic Stress, using a psychosensory model. Okay, so traumatic stress is trauma, things that happened to you that overwhelmed you. And many, many people have things in their childhood that overwhelm them, but they may not be coded traumatically. You need 4 things in place for that. And I did sort of introduce that last week, but I'll just remind you. And it creates a sort of stress response that's completely maladaptive and unremitting. So it doesn't go away, it stays in place. So stress is meant to be a one-time thing that activates you to either flee or fight, or sometimes to collapse if that's not going to, it's inescapable and you can't get away. So, it's meant to be a life-threatening event that creates this stress. But of course, we don't live that way anymore. We live with continual threats to our livelihoods, to our sense of self, to our safety in maybe in our jobs, in our lives, and so on. And so trauma actually is really, really common. And it's happening probably in current life, but it's also referring to or associated with past events. Childhood is a particularly vulnerable time for everyone, because you have very little power and very little ability to escape what's happening to you or fight what's happening to you. And so these collapse states, I've heard it called the fold response. Yesterday, I watched a video where he called it a fold response. We also do call it passive freeze. It's that collapsed feeling that nothing's worth doing. And that's depression in a nutshell. Okay, so anxiety is the sense of I've got to run, I've got to flee, or I've got to fight whatever it is, but I don't know what it is that I'm fighting or fleeing. And depression is the, oh, what's the point? I might as well give up. And so you can see they're two sides of the same coin, but they're one's an active response and the other is a passive one. And so you've got your childhood experiences which mold the brain, they landscape it. That's the term we use, they landscape it. They create certain connections in your brain which become a pattern for the rest of your life. And so it's very, very common to have experiences in childhood which overwhelmed you, because that, after all, the definition of childhood is really powerlessness in many, many ways. And what's happening in the current life is that little events in your life which trigger certain emotional responses are going back to the pattern that they learned when you were a child and kind of reconstituting them in your brain. And then you get the fight response or the fold response, anxiety or depression. And so in order to get to the root of what's causing this, we have to deal with the initiating events and the meanings you made of them. Now, we talked last week a little bit about the 4 requirements for an event to be encoded as a trauma, and I'll just remind you. So the first, an event must occur. Okay, you must have an event which overwhelms you. But actually, it can be first, second, or third hand. In other words, it can be something that happened to you, something that you're part of and witnessing, or something that somebody told you. Now, that can happen with very highly sensitive nervous systems. I can remember being completely traumatized by watching a TV program when I was little, about a fire in a flat, and watching a mother and 2 children being under the most awful conditions and thought they were going to die. And that resonated with me for days and weeks and months afterwards. I've never forgotten it. That's the nature of my nervous system. And I'm sure there are many of you out there who can echo some of what I'm saying. So you have the event, which can be, it can be experienced, or what we call vicarious. In other words, it's something that you witness but you're not part of. Then the event has to have a certain meaning which is sensed as a threat. All right, and a threat might not be a physical threat like I'm going to die. It could be if you're involved in an accident, for instance, but it could also be a threatened loss of attachment. So you lose your job, or somebody criticizes you where you feel really vulnerable in that moment. It could be you get ill for whatever reason, and you can no longer work, and work was always your mainstay, and it was the thing that made you you, and so you've lost your attachment to your sense of identity. So it can be very broad, that particular requirement. The main thing is that it has to generate an emotional response in you. And look, emotional responses are not always overtly experienced. They are with many people. You burst into tears, you get really angry. But for very many people, emotional responses have been so repressed over many years that you only get a sort of vague symptom in the body, like your stomach goes in knots, or your shoulders tighten, or you get a sort of numb, tingly feeling down your legs, or perhaps a restless leg feeling. These are dissociated emotions, okay? It may be hard to understand that at first, but that is what's going on. Now, the meaning derives its power from our threatened loss of attachment, right? So we're attached to living, to being alive. So a threat to your sense of being alive, death threat, from, as I've said, an accident or something really overt that happens to you. But it could be our bodies. So something goes wrong with your body. I had a bit of my tooth fell out a couple of weeks ago. And for a day, at least 24 hours after that, my whole system was on edge. I felt like a part of me had gone, which truly it had. Obviously, it was fixable, but I was asking around and saying, does anyone else feel like that when things happen to your body? And most people were like, well, no, just visit the dentist, or I go get it sorted. it's like, for me, there was a real reverberation, and it took me ages to really deal with that. And only through reaching out and getting an appointment, perceived safety, was I able to re-regulate myself. So it can be a thing like that. We're attached to our friends. So if a friend rejects you, that's happened to me in the past, several times actually, or a relationship that breaks down, and our sense of who we are in the community. So if you look at the post office scandal in the UK, you know, where people who were considered the pillar of their local community because they ran the village post office, were erroneously, it turned out, accused of stealing, because the system, the new electronic system that the post office brought in was faulty. And they were accused of stealing from their local communities and ostracized. And some people committed suicide, and many people lost their livelihoods and were emotionally damaged by that. So it could be that you were attacked in some way about who you are, but threatened loss of attachment. So that's number 2. Number 3 is a vulnerable landscape. Okay, so and now what does that mean? That means a stress-filled brain, all right, that already has a lot of electromagnetic activity of threat going on. So the brain is not just a bag of water and fatty tissue. It has an electrochemistry, right? It vibrates at certain frequencies. You've probably heard about different brainwave states. This is important, because if your brain is already in a stress state, it's much more likely to be stimulated by these threatened loss of attachments. So we have a high sensitivity depending on what we've experienced before, and maybe our innate sensitivity, which, as I've said, is 20% of the population. So that's number 3. The 4th thing, and this is the most important because this is the one that can be changed, is perceived inescapability. Perceived inescapability, right? Now, in the natural non-human world, as he says in the paper, one either escapes or is killed, all right? So if you're living in the bush in a tribe, the worst life threat you'll ever come across is you're going to be prey for another animal, and you're going to die, or you're going to run away and escape. And those are the 2 options. Because we don't have that in modern life, often the threats don't have an outcome. All right. So in a car accident where we're tumbling out of control, that there's a tremendous sense of, oh my gosh, I'm going to die. What's going to happen? A perceived inescapability, and it, depending on how that works out and how you're treated in the minutes and hours after that event, it may be encoded traumatically because you thought you were going to die, and your brain in some ways doesn't know you've escaped, and so it's keeping that going. And we find that actually with rally car drivers. All right, rally car drivers often crash. They may tumble, but they don't get trauma because it was something they expected. All right, if something comes to you out of the blue, maybe a rear collision or a sideways collision, and you didn't see it coming, you're much more likely to be traumatized from that. So those 4 things are both sufficient and necessary, okay? If one of those things, in particular, the inescapability, is not present, it won't be encoded traumatically. It will have significant effect on you, but it won't keep hanging around, keep triggering you. And so that one is the one that we can kind of change, maybe. And Havening does that, and I'm going to explain in a minute how it does that. But one more thing, which is really important to understand, because a lot of people ask me, well, hang on, I had a good childhood, nothing really overwhelmed me that much. You know, I found a way through, I had good parents, I was loved. Why am I traumatized? Because I just don't believe I am. Well, an event may occur and be encoded as traumatic, but it may not be an overt traumatic experience. As I've said, it may be the meaning you made of something. So say you grew up in an environment where you were very loved, but there was a lot of pressure put on you to perform for some reason, to be successful or to be a good person who gave back to her community. The perception of that in your mind is that is who you are, that is your self. And if anything comes along later in life that knocks you off that and stops you being the self that you were kind of encouraged to be, there is this terrible sense of, I'm no longer me. I've lost my sense of connection to who I am. And that is definitely traumatic. And it may lead to symptoms such as chronic pain, chronic fatigue, which I do believe chronic fatigue syndrome is a traumatically encoded issue that expresses itself at the cellular level. It shuts down your cellular machinery. But it may be because the symptoms don't come immediately after the traumatic event. So you might have had, I don't know, a traumatic event at school or in your first job, or maybe your first relationship breaks down. And you may cope, as certainly I did. You may manage it for a while on adrenaline and keep going and keep going. And then at some point, the system kind of can't maintain itself anymore, and symptoms start to develop. Symptoms of usually there'll be some autonomic symptom, dizziness, poor digestion, insomnia, pain, as I've said, and eventually sometimes also fatigue. The expression of symptoms does not always directly relate to a particular traumatic event, but rather from the cumulative effect of unrelated stressors. All right. So it may be different events in your life have gradually accumulated to form a sort of stress landscape, which I described last week as the allostatic load. Okay. And it just tips over. Just at one point, it tips over into overwhelm. And that is when symptoms will occur. And so they may be many years or even decades after the initiating events of your childhood or your early adulthood. But the current stress just tips you over the edge. And so that's a really important concept. So it's this accumulation over a lifetime of stressors, and we're seeing younger and younger people actually getting to that point. And so it's teenagers now and people in their 20s, where it used to be people in their 40s and 50s who got these conditions. It's not uncommon to see this unrelated set of symptoms, or we think they're unrelated, but in fact, because they're linked by the somatosensory and autonomic nervous systems, that this is the long-term effect of a lifetime of stress. Okay, so that's how it's formed. What can we do about it? And this is really important, because I don't want you to go away thinking that you can't solve this. Look, if we change the sense of inescapability, we take away the thing that keeps it going, because it has to have all four. And so what we ask people to do when we're working with people as psychosensory therapists is we ask them to recall a traumatic event. And now it can be one that's really recent or one that's a long time ago. Honestly, it doesn't matter, because the brain associates with all of them, if particularly the emotion and the kind of meaning was the same. So we might start with something more recent if that's the most potent. Say if you're suffering a phobia, for instance, you can't go out the house, or you can't drive over a bridge, or there's all sorts of phobias. Emetophobia is another one. So imagining someone being sick or seeing them being sick is enough to send your amygdala into firing, and you either have to run away or hide. It's quite a terrible condition. Phobias are really very immediate threats to the system. So we can't change the event. It happened, all right? We can't change the meaning, which is, well, eventually we can, but the originating meaning was that I'm unsafe. We can change the vulnerability gradually over time as we reduce this stress load. But the main thing we're going for initially is to change the sense of inescapability, all right, and to give people a safe haven, which is why he calls it havening. So when we get people to imagine the feeling or the event, we light up the same pathways in the brain that happened at the initiation. So when you first experienced it and it was encoded traumatically. So we ask you to feel the feeling, if possible. If it's not possible to feel the feeling, some people have shut down their feeling system. We ask you to just notice what's going on in the body when you remember that event, because there will be a response. It may not just be overtly emotional. It may be, as I've said, a group of symptoms. And then we use a procedure called havening, which is using gentle touch down the arms. We may ask you to say some words. We may ask you to sing a song. This is distraction. We may ask you to count from 1 to 20 while you're doing that. Okay. Touch signals safety. Why? Well, the answer lies in evolutionary biology. As Rudin says, it begins at birth. So when you come into the world as a newborn, you can't speak, you can't understand language, and you have an innate fear of abandonment because that's hardwired in and might cause you to die if you're not fed. So you learn to cry. The mother, it's the mother normally, whose brain is suffused in oxytocin, if she's your birth mother, that's a bonding hormone. It's also the one that induces labor, by the way, but at this point in the cycle, it's the bonding hormone. Here, she'll hear the cry, and that suffusion in her brain should drive her to hold, stroke, and comfort her newborn. It doesn't always, as we unfortunately have learned through the experiences of many, many people, is that the quality of mothering is very variable, of course, depending on the mother's experience herself. And so she will touch the baby, hopefully, and the baby learns comfort and soothing. And this is how our brains are wired to feel, comfort, to feel like we belong, to feel like our bodies belong to us and they're okay, and we're going to be loved and held, and our needs are satisfied. All right, but obviously this is a shortcut for that, okay? And just self-touch when in visual connection with someone, audio visual connection with someone is even better. And so we ask you to activate the memory, rate the memory. Then we use Havening touch with this distraction, singing, counting. Sometimes we use eye movements as well at the same time. And then we ask the person to re-rate. So we say, compared with how it was when we started, think of that memory again, think of that feeling. And what you're looking for is a score that drops or changes. We call it the SUD, or subjective unit of distress. Don't worry about that. But we ask people to rate it before and after. And what we find, and this is definitely something I found, is either the score goes down, usually a lot. It feels less accessible to the person. So they can't quite get the feeling that they had at the beginning. It feels more distant. The emotional content might be changed. It no longer feels dreadful, or a pulling sensation, or overwhelming. The memory is blocked completely or inaccessible. They just can't find it. It's just it's there, but it's not there. It's a long way away. Sometimes people describe it as being faded out or fuzzy. It's gone black and white where it was color before, is another common experience. Or it's viewed from a distance, as if by a detached observer. So they're no longer seeing it as themselves in the situation, but viewing themselves in the situation. So now we have a sort of distance of third person viewing what happened. I've also found that people really respond if that doesn't bring the unit of distress down to 0, which is what we're hoping for, no distress at all, that we might need to go in and resolve the ending metaphorically. So we might add a new ending to what actually happened. And we may say a child is being bullied at school. We can't change what happened to that person, but we can imaginally go in and pick her up and take her away, or we can tell off the people who are bullying her and stop it happening. The imagination is so powerful, and it's also activating your back brain, which is the part of your brain which creates emotional memory in the first place. And so it's using the part of the brain that actually has the issue to change this feeling of inescapability. And once that is resolved, even though it actually didn't happen in reality, it's as if the brain responds to this new ending as truth. And the person can actually see themselves as having escaped the situation. And that is the most remarkable of all, I think. And so I hope that was helpful to you to understand that the mind body, which is one thing, okay, is an electrical system, not just a bag of chemistry. And that dysfunctional circuitry is at the heart of why people suffer all manner of stress-related issues. And, you know, adding in a new rhythm, which is what Havening does. I talked about that last time. It has a alpha down to delta rhythm. And so slows everything down in the brain and just allows you to calm down, has the potential to break the chain of unconsciously remembered events in your life which underlie anxiety and depression. I hope that was something that will help you to understand why we get these conditions and what you can do about it. Because please believe there are solutions out there, and they don't involve taking pharmaceutical drugs for the rest of your life. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to comment or take part in any of my courses or work with me, you can find all my contact details below. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.